So welcome everybody to this panel discussion on gender responsive standards organized by the Government of Canada and the European Union as part of the activities and celebrations for this International Women's Week. Today we're going to discuss why considering gender in standardization is important, how it benefits everyone, and the impact that gender responsive standards can have in facilitating women's participation in our economies and global trade. My name is Melissa Gibson, and I work for the International Organization of Standardization, ISO, at the Central Secretariat in Geneva, Switzerland. I will be facilitating our conversation today, but just before I go any further, a couple of quick housekeeping points. So our discussion is scheduled to last for around 45 minutes, and afterwards we'll have a short Q&A session. Your questions can be submitted at any time, however, and to do that, just use the Q&A button in the box that you'll have. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you find the toolbar and there's the Q&A box there. So you just submit them through this. Et vous trouvez également une traduction simultanée en français. Pour accéder, veuillez sélectionner le bouton Interprétation qui est situé en bas dans le bas d'outils de votre fenêtre Zoom. So, I would now like to invite Benny Fish to make the opening remarks. Benny is from the Directorate General for Trade of the European Commission, where in his role as a policy officer, he covers the gender, development, and environmental aspects of trade policy. Benny previously worked on the implementation of the EU's Generalized Scheme of Preferences and of trade and sustainable development chapters of EU trade agreements. Benny.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm delighted that you could be here with us today to share with us your expertise in the area of gender responsive standards and lead what I'm sure will be a very enriching discussion with our panelists. Before we get started, I would just like to contextualize the discussion to our audience joining us today. I can safely and unequivocally say that the EU and Canada are global leaders when it comes to the insertion of gender equality and women's economic empowerment considerations into our respective trade policies. On both sides of the Atlantic, this work is cross-cutting, including impact assessments, policy design, policy reviews, as well as groundbreaking work on methodologies and data collection. I'm also proud that we have jointly acted as driving forces advancing this important topic at the WTO as well. But most importantly for our discussion today, our Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA in short, which has been in effect since 2017, has been at the forefront in integrating trade and gender considerations into an FTA context. We have done so through an ambitious recommendation on trade and gender from the CETA Joint Committee, which was signed in 2018. Through this recommendation, our two sides have not only reinforced our commitment to international conventions and mechanisms related to gender equality and women's economic empowerment, but we have also established an important platform for cooperation and discussion of these issues. Since then, we have carried out a number of activities ranging from bilateral policy exchanges, public events, stakeholder engagement, and close cooperation in multilateral fora. We published an initial joint report on these activities last September, jointly with a work plan of activities for the near future. Both documents are published on both the EU and Canada's respective websites, and I do invite all of our audience to check them out. We'll be posting the links on the chat here on the site for your reference. Today's panel's discussion marks the first public event under this current work plan, and what better occasion to do so, I think, than the week of International Women's Day. I'm sure that all of us have attended a number of events this week which have highlighted just how insidious gender discrimination and disparities can be, even in areas where it may not be so obvious. And one such area are technical barriers to trade, under which standards feature prominently. But what exactly is the nexus between trade, gender, and standards? How can gender responsive standards contribute to more inclusive trade policy designs and outcomes? And what role can governments, industry, and international organizations play? I'm delighted that we have a panel full of distinguished speakers from across these realms to share with us their expertise here today. And with this, I would like to give the floor back to Melissa so that she can get this conversation started. Thank you very much and looking forward to this.
Thank you, Benny. It's really encouraging to hear that although we've only been discussing gender responsive standards for the last couple of years, you're already achieving a lot and it's really becoming integrated in policy at that level. And I have to say that although those those accomplishments are significant, I still think that despite this, one of our biggest challenges is still about building awareness around gender responsive standards and understanding the benefits that they bring. Many of you participating today, as Benny's just said, we've seen you in other events this week, and you're well immersed in this topic. However, for other people, it's a new concept. So to take a step back for a moment, why are we talking so much about gender responsive standards? Where did this all come from? So in recent years, developments like the adoption of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 5 to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, and movements like #MeToo, have increased our awareness of gender bias and the impact that this bias has on our day-to-day lives. From equal participation to access to opportunities and markets, and products and processes often designed only for men's needs, we're finally noticing how our world has not been supporting and providing for women's needs as well. It also seems obvious that standards should be developed to meet the needs of everybody who uses them. But for many years, the approach has often been to consider standards as purely technical or mainly intended for use in traditional industries dominated by men and therefore excluding women, or at best written to be gender neutral. An illustration of just how important considering gender and standardization is can be shown in a recent study published by the Standards Council of Canada, which found that there is a correlation between wealth and standardization in decreasing accidental fatalities for men. However, standardization activities have no impact on decreasing women's fatalities. International, regional, and national standards organizations, supported by initiatives such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE's Declaration on Gender Responsive Standards, which I will note has so far been signed by 68 standards development organizations, which include ISO, Sentinelec, and the Standards Council of Canada, are committed to working towards not only increasing women's participation in standardization, but also exploring how to best modify processes and provide supporting measures and resources for the standards development communities. The goal is to ensure that going forward, standards will respond to the needs of both males and females. And this work will benefit all of us, socially and economically. Not only will it improve safety by ensuring products and processes are designed for both men and women, it will boost our economies and improve women's access to markets. Various studies have estimated that achieving gender equality could lead to increases of approximately 4% of gross domestic product across the world. And in many cases, this estimation is even higher. I've come across a study specifically for the European Union that suggests that if gender equality is achieved by 2050, which is one of the EU's goals, it could see GDP increase by as much as 9%. So enough from me today. We're lucky to have a group of panelists who are working on a day-to-day basis to help us reach this goal of not only gender responsive standards and standards development processes, but also true gender equality. So I'd like to introduce them to you. With us, we have Gurvinder Chopra, who is Vice President, Standards and Regulation at Electro Federation Canada, a not-for-profit association of Canadian electrical manufacturers, distributors, and manufacturers' representatives. A marine engineer by training, before joining the Electro Federation, he sailed on ships and worked in various management roles for organizations like Lloyd's Register, the British Standards Institution, and the Canadian Standards Association Group. Welcome, Gurvinder. Dr. Karen Iffinger is the Standards and Technical Relations Manager at Textiles in Belgium. She has a PhD in solid-state physics and has been working in standardization since 2009 after taking over the convenership of one of SEN's working groups on smart textiles. In 2015, she moved completely into standardization as manager standards and technical regulations at Textiles. And I also note Karen is heavily involved in ISO standardization activities. Judith Feshay is Policy and Data Lead at the She Trades Initiative at the International Trade Center, a joint agency of UNCTAD and the World Trade Organization. In this capacity, she manages projects related to trade policy and women's economic empowerment at global and regional levels, gender disaggregated data collection and analysis, and technical support to national trade and trade-related policy reforms. Deborah Walter is Project Manager Engagement with Sentinelec at the European Committee for Standardization and the European Committee for Electrotechnical Standardization. She is responsible for the engagement of industry and societal stakeholders in European standardization. She supports the inclusiveness and transparency of the system by leading projects to enhance the participation of European partners, small and medium enterprises, civil society and industry, and brings a gender-responsive perspective to the system. And last but certainly not least, we have Gabrielle White, who works in trade policy as a senior policy analyst at the Standards Council of Canada, SCC. Her work focuses on standards and conformance, and she oversees SCC's input to standardization components of Canada's free trade agreements and regulatory cooperation. In addition to her work on trade policy, Gabrielle is responsible for spearheading SCC's gender and standardization strategy. So I'm very excited about the discussion that we're about to have with all of our experts, who I'm sure are really going to help us better understand how gender responsive standards can contribute to trade and the challenges and benefits around them. And I'd like to actually start with Gabrielle and go back to the basics. Gabrielle, why do you think gender is important in standardization?
Thanks, Melissa. And I'm happy to kick things off today. And I just want to say it's a real honor to be presenting on this panel today with all of my distinguished colleagues. So I want to begin by saying that standards permeate everyday life, and their role is influential in shaping the design of social life and public infrastructure. I think all product design begins by describing which problem needs solving. But the question is, the problem according to who? Because standards are often applied to inanimate objects like technologies, there's often a perception that they are neutral. However, when inanimate objects are created and shaped by people, they can perpetuate biases. So standards require a balanced matrix of stakeholders to ensure that one stakeholder group doesn't outnumber another. However, it is becoming increasingly obvious that the lack of women involved in standardization is exacerbating a gender bias in the standards that are developed. Here at the Standards Council of Canada, we've collected sex disaggregated data on the volunteers who participate in our international committees at the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC. And we know that women make up roughly 20% of those volunteers. And from our engagement with other national standards bodies, we know that Canada's numbers are not unique. So clearly we have a representation gap around the table, and that gap has resulted in safety and performance issues for women. For instance, women are at a 73% higher risk of serious to fatal injury during a car collision because crash test dummies are based on male anthropometry. This is just one example of many. The current pandemic has shed light on the many challenges women face with ill-fitting personal protective equipment. These examples demonstrate that the low participation of women in standardization is problematic. While you do not need to be a woman to develop a gender responsive standard, it can be really difficult to come up with solutions to a problem you haven't faced yourself, particularly if you're not even aware the problem exists. So furthermore, I think it also requires us to challenge the fact that the male perspective has come to be seen as universal, while the female experience is niche. He is the subject, she is the other. So the work we're doing at the Standards Council of Canada is focused on making women's and men's concerns and experiences an integral dimension in the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of policies and programs so that women and men benefit equally from standardization and to ensure inequality is not perpetuated in the standardization system.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Sorry. I think that you've made some really important points there, and this is not just about participating, more women participating, but it's really, it's much larger than just having women sitting at the table. But for sure, having more women around the table is going to have an impact. And I found it interesting that you're saying that we're unaware that there's a problem. I think that even women sometimes are unaware that there is a problem as well, because we're so used to living in a world that actually we don't even realize products are there for us to use because they're just inaccessible to us. I was wondering, Deborah, why do you think gender is important for standardization?
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for having me today. I'm very happy to participate here. Thank you for Gabriel for making my job much easier by being second. I think the way I like to ask the question is, why shouldn't gender be important for standardization? What does happen when we adopt a gender responsive approach to standards? Because to me, it's much easier to answer. Because when you put yourself in the shoes of standardizers, what we strive for is to putting together in one deliverable a combined reflection of a consensual agreement on combining all the relevant inputs and points of view. So because Gabrielle said it, and as standardizers, it's very clear that the more diverse the inputs into a deliverable, the better adapted to all needs the deliverable will be, the more relevant to a wider audience, and thus overall a higher quality standard. So of course, gender is one of the dimension. It's not an exception. A gender responsive standard is a standard that will be more relevant and address the needs of both men and women, and hence be a better quality deliverable that equally benefit everyone and eventually reaches a greatest market acceptance. So really, gender responsiveness is good for business. That's also something I like to say. And that's something that's very clear for us at Sensenelec, the importance, the benefits of inclusivity as a whole, openness, diversity in our system is very much a core value. And in fact, it's one of the goals of our recently published Strategy 2030, which I invite you to have a look. We very much recognize the fact that standards have an influential role on society, and hence that it's very important to have the diversity of profiles of users and their diverse needs in mind when we are developing deliverables, so that we can make sure that they protect everyone and don't actually do the opposite for some of them. So yeah, that includes women, of course, but we have a very broader approach at Sensenelec towards inclusivity. You mentioned that I was responsible for including more, making sure that civil society, SMEs, but also, innovators, regulators are part of making all of our deliverables. And then I just want to comment on something you guys just exchanged about, yes, the more women at the table, the more diverse and inclusive the inputs, but we can't stop there. More women in a group does not guarantee gender responsiveness. I think that's very clear. Being a woman does not make you a gender expert per se. So that's why it's very crucial to have that type of discussions with all the relevant stakeholders, because I strongly believe that this is a change that needs to be driven by the entire community, and that we need to get everybody involved. So I'm very glad about that. And then my last point would be about the gender neutrality of standards that is usually perceived by standardizers. It's actually the first thing that I'm trying to break when I start speaking about the topic. We can't undermine the gendered impact of some of our standards, and the first thing I invite standardizers to do, and my colleagues responsible for different technical committees, is you need to assume that every standard is gender sensitive, because you mentioned the dummies, to the test crash dummies, Gabriel. PPE is a very easy example. consumer products in general, you can very much see, okay, how it's going to impact differently a man and a woman. But it doesn't stop there. It can have an impact on standards that are for services, that are for processes, impacting the workers' condition, etc. So yeah, that would be my point. Gender responsiveness is key for producing better deliverables. We need everybody on board, putting their gender and overall inclusivity lenses on when they draft standards, so we can strengthen our content of the standards themselves and also enable inclusive standard development processes as a whole.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And also, I noted one little thing when you mentioned about things not being designed for women, and there's economic benefits for that as well. I think that a lot of things, because women are excluded, we don't necessarily buy the products or use the processes because they're not adapted to us. And an easy example is wearables, for example, which is a technology that's very big. I definitely chosen my wearable based on the design, which is adapted to my wrist, and whereas a watch, which is a larger thing, is so there's economic benefits for manufacturers as well. But Govinda, you're working directly within an industry, and I would also imagine it's quite a traditional industry. I hope it's changing. But does your industry think there is a need for gender inclusive standards, or do you think it's more about gender neutrality?
Absolutely. Thank you, Melissa. And thanks for having me on this critical and important discussion. So I believe that women not only make a valuable contribution to the products, services, and systems that drive our society, they also deserve to have an equal voice in their development. It is important to encourage equal representation in standardization, to strengthen the participation of women in the development of international standards, and to make them more relevant to women around the world. So representing the electrical manufacturers in Canada, amongst businesses, it is very clear that creating inclusive, high trust cultures that engage, support, and empower women is good for innovation, good for employees, and good for businesses, which in turn implies that there is a compelling need of gender diversity and gender inclusive standards, what we are talking about. So gender diversity in standards and gender inclusive standards are certainly critical. 100 years ago, women in most countries were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to drive or buy property or work in many industries. Their voice was being left out from the society they contributed to. And limiting the available talent to contribute to standardization could have a significant bearing on the growth, competitiveness, and future readiness of economies and businesses worldwide. Progress is being made, yeah, but we need to do better as the gender equality gap remains. Standards and codes have treated women the same as men, which is, in this case, is not the appropriate approach for many reasons. Gabriel and Deborah, you both mentioned about women being the victims of the majority of the fatal injuries during car collisions. Same is the case with location of, I'm taking an automotive example, I'm fond of cars. Same is the case with the location of brake pedals in a car, which falls short for many women. So there is definitely a need to address this critical topic. Thank you.
Melissa, you're muted.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriella. I'm sorry. It's really encouraging to hear that industries that were not traditionally thought of as needing to be gender inclusive are realizing and stepping up for that. It's really encouraging. So keeping all of this in mind, I'd like to address now what are recent developments within your organizations to address this need for gender responsive standards. Deborah, I understand at Sensenelec you're very active on this topic. Perhaps you might like to tell us what you're doing.
Yeah. You already mentioned that Stan and Senelec are signatory of the UNSC Declaration on Gender Responsive Standards. And that's the work to develop that declaration was really the start of this conversation, or the booster of the conversation within Stan and Senelec. And really encouraging is that not only Sensenelec signed, but also more than 20 of our members are individual signatories. So it's a clear sign that our community is moving together towards more gender equality in standardization. Following that signature, we've adopted a gender action plan within Senelec, and we've actually based it on a survey that we've launched around our members to gather their best practices, what they were doing about it, or planning to do as a newly signatory of the declaration, but also gathering maybe challenges that some of the experts may be facing at national, European, or international level, really gathering all of the experiences. And based on that, we've developed a gender action plan where Sensenelec had, where we had identified the key priority on what Sensenelec should do. Obviously, as all of our activities, the focus is to support our members. And here we very much focused on the one hand, facilitating exchanges of our members and enabling collaborations with our members, but also with our key European and international stakeholders, such as ISO, IEC, to name a few. Implementation activities are led by a group, informal coordination group on gender that we have established in 2020. It's a very diverse group consisting of a lot of different profiles, which I think is really nice. And we were just discussing together, all the panelists, before we started, that it's very nice that we have Benny and Gurvinder as part of our conversation, because again, we need to move on together. Well, in our group, we've encouraged all our members to nominate a man and a woman to be present at the table. So not only are we repeating like diversity in this way, but also, you know, we have HR directors that are there. We have directors for standardization work. We have engagements managers from members. So this is so enriching to get such different point of views in that group. And so they help and they really lead the work on raising awareness about the importance, the benefits of gender diversity in standardization towards our European community. Again, by sharing good practices, discussing the advancement of gender actions in members' organizations, exchanging as well with other groups within Sen and Senelec that have similar interests or objectives. For example, we just hosted a webinar, Melissa, I think you know about, last Wednesday. That's part of a training series that we do that is dedicated to our standard makers. So that's one of the most recent deliverables that we've put together. And then that group also ensures that alignment of work with ISO and IEC and UNEC, actually, because our members very much act as a sort of liaisons from the different groups that exist at international level. So we're able to follow closely the group that is going on at that level as well, making sure that we don't duplicate the work, but rather complement each other and streamline our activities. And then in addition to that, to really complement the gender action plan activities, we continue to engage in several sectoral European organizations for gender equality in particular sectors of interest for Sen and Senelec. So for example, we are participating in the Women in Energy Club for energy. And for cybersecurity, we are very much committed to the Women for Cyber Foundation, where we are providing our support. And this type of participation is very much reflected by our members at national level, because they are involved in similar national sectoral organizations. Because I think I'm a bit jumping the gun, because it's one of the best practices that I would recommend, but those existing groups of women in particular sectors, it's one of the already existing resources where we as standardizers can turn to and promote standardization to women experts in cyber, in energy, etc., and hopefully increase the participation of women in our relative technical activities. And then if I can look into the future as my last point, it's not something we've recently done, but we are currently doing it, so I feel like it counts. it's that for the strategy 2030, we are currently developing our implementation plan with all the projects that will help us concretize our objectives. As I said, one of the goals is very much looking at attracting more diverse profiles of standard makers. So there, I don't know yet what it's going to look like, but I'm very much excited and looking forward to the work we're going to do there towards more gender diversity, but diversity as a whole.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a big, very broad set of actions, but I think it's really important that you're looking at all aspects, that we are looking at all aspects. And Karen, I think that you can talk very easily about what's happening in the textiles area and give us some specific examples of how you're changing the approach in order to consider gender responsiveness, that you've also got experience across very, very broad standardization experience where you can see where there are changes that are needed to be made and how to do that. So I would like to hear from you. Can you explain how gender responsiveness is changing the approach of the textiles industry?
Thank you, Melissa, for your question, and also thank you for the organizers for inviting me to be here. So it was briefly mentioned in abbreviation, Centexpel is the Center for the Textile Industry in Belgium. We're a membership organization, so I'm representing a bit ourselves and our members. We're active in the textile industry, also the personal protective equipment, because that was already mentioned before as one of the more problematic issues for gender responsiveness. I think Melissa mentioned, or Gabriella mentioned that a bit in the beginning, that also there was a problem coming forth with the current health crisis. Especially when we look at, with textiles, it's actually a bit better because they form the basis. They've done or worked a lot on the analysis of sizing. As you know, clothing comes in all kinds of different sizes, men's, children's, women's, Asians, Northern Europeans, yeah, you really have a very large distribution of sizes just going through the world population and all ages. Even changing ages change the sizing of the clothing. So from the textile industry point of view, there's a lot of studies also being performed. But when we go to the personal protective equipment community, this shifts a bit. You start to have more manufacturers. You have different manufacturers. They have different customers. So they then try to more focus on maybe a bit of a more limited sizing, which is fitting the largest amount of their stakeholders. So then you already lose a bit of this big diversity that has been developed. And that's really, I think, because while in the textile industry or in the textile committees, you see quite a lot of women present in the committees also, which then, yeah, even tend, if I can go beyond with the sizing, also take into account children's sizing or smaller sizings. You then have, with the less representation in these working groups for the protective equipment, also the female needs are taken less into account. As I said, developing standards is you have to go towards a certain compromise and a consensus, and it's sometimes not so easy to do, like was mentioned with the crash test dummies. If you have to do it on a man, a woman, and a child, you have 3 tests. If you do it on one, take the some average size, it's just one test. It costs you a lot less money. So quite a lot of times these factors play a major role in why certain testing is then limited to, yeah, something reflecting an average, but quite often, unfortunately, male Northern European even, which I often refer to a kind of a standard size. So what are we doing at Centexpel is, for one, we also try to listen to all our different stakeholders. Yeah, try to also encourage the women's participation, try to encourage a bit the cross feeding between the different sectors. And also, as I already mentioned before, there's a lot of data that needs to be collected on sizing. So what you have to do is you have to go and cooperate in research projects where these data is being collected. So it's not that far that we've been doing as was discussed by Deborah before, but with small steps, we are moving forward in this direction to improve things. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And I think what you've just described explains why it makes the perfect argument for why it's really important that we are starting to look at the gender implication on standards, because so often until now it's been driven by cost benefits, which they see as sort of a global size that will fit as many people as possible. So it reduces costs, but that's not really solving the problem, reducing the accidents, selling the products that women are not going to buy products that don't fit them, etc. So there's also market opportunities there. Govinda, you earlier explained about how greater gender inclusiveness will bring many benefits to your industry. So what specific measures has the IFC taken to actually achieve this?
Sure. So first of all, discussions on this gender diversity started in my house a few years back when my daughter, who was in high school at that time, she showed interest in gender diversity. And of course, as a father, and I had to comply with that. So that is how it started. Let me tell you first. So Electro Federation Canada, as I mentioned, we are an association of electrical manufacturers, is leading by example. Out of our 14 staff members, 12 are women and 2 are men. Okay, so that is how we are projecting and we are walking the talk. In the electrical sector in Canada, issues are not limited to gender diverse standards or women in standards development. It is much more than that. The underrepresentation of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as we know that as STEM education and workforce, suggests that it is much less likely for women to reach positions in which they would be candidates for becoming an organization's representative in standardization committees. According to Engineers Canada, women make up a dismal 22% of engineering undergraduates, and only 13% of licensed engineers in Canada are women. So we need to tackle the pipeline issue for women, that is to encourage more women to enter the technical electrical world and then steer them or entice them to work in standards development. You know, at Electro Federation, we have included a goal of promoting gender diversity on the platform of our technical committees. We have understood that the need of engaging women in STEM and standardization at an early age to create the baseline is required to have a greater participation of women in the electrical sector, not at university level, because that also has been a talk. We need to start and target girls in high schools, because that is the time when they start looking into the various fields. So EFC has implemented a 3-tier program to address diversity within our membership. Number 1, executive communication. We are involving executives of over 220 members to be on board. The number 2 is incorporate diversity into HR committee as a standing agenda item, which tends to educate members on available programs or the best-in-class initiatives. And number 3, female empowerment through the launch of the EFC Women's Network. Now, just for your information, this has celebrated its 1-year milestone with over 220 members across Canada participating in it. And the theme of empowerment focuses on personal branding, understanding differences and promoting strengths, finding mentors, sponsors, and improving networking skills. EFC's Women's Network program provides a comfortable, collaborative environment for women in the electrical workforce. I was talking to one of our members 2 days back. It's a 1,500 employee organization, 1,000 technicians, and 13 women. Okay, out of those 1,000 technicians, 13 women. So within this women's network, what I've spoken about, 3 core strategic pillars have been established: professional development, empowerment, and improving the lifestyle. So, and lastly, I would definitely like to stress upon here with the recent collaboration between Electro Federation and Standards Council of Canada, with directive coming from the chief executives of both these organizations. This has become a very important and top priority within the electrical industry who is joining the platform. Thank you.
Thank you for ending on such an encouraging note after slightly depressing us all with your statistics about women's participation in this sector. I really liked your comment that we need to entice women to enter the standardization world. I think that all of the standards organizations have the same need, and I think that what you're doing sounds like you've got quite a few best practices that we could all take a closer look at and perhaps integrate into our own organizations as well. So thank you for that. So we've been talking quite a lot about the developments and initiatives that are happening in specific regions and industries. So European Union, electrotechnical area, personal protective equipment and textiles. But perhaps we could move this and discuss a bit further about the subject from an international trade perspective. So to look at what are some of the current benefits and challenges of gender inclusive standards for international trade. So I was wondering, Gabrielle, perhaps you could explain to us how standards link to international trade.
Sure, yeah, sure, Melissa, I'm happy to. So I think the link between standards, gender, and trade is multi-pronged. There are 2 things in particular that come to mind. The first is around supply chains. So standards establish and explain the performance requirements for products and services. And these standards often then form the basis of technical regulations, which therefore means they play an integral role in the movement of goods across borders, because they can dictate the minimum requirements for those goods coming into a country. So if we can ensure the standards are gender responsive through their performance requirements, then those products and services are proliferated in a way that keeps everyone safe. And I think trade plays a really important role in that. In other words, standards can be a catalyst for change by forming the building blocks upon which goods and services are traded. I think another important element of the trade discussion that I want to mention here, and that I think we need to think about, is the role of institutions like the World Trade Organization. The trade space is one of the only places where standards and technical regulations are disciplined. So I think this discussion is very important as we think about how we can create change and tackle this issue from a systemic perspective to improve the inclusiveness of trade.
Yeah, thank you, Gabrielle. I totally agree with you. And I think, Judith, your organization being at the forefront of supporting internationalization for small and medium enterprises, could you help us understand what the implications of gender inclusive standards, excuse me, have on international trade, and especially in light of what Gabrielle has just said about those international trade organizations playing a key part in all of this?
Yes, thank you very much, Melissa. And first of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting the ITC to participate in this important discussion. So let me take a step back. I would like to discuss about the issue of compliance to standards for women-owned businesses, in particular for women-owned SMEs. So the first thing to say is obviously that compliance to standards, it's only part of a bigger and structural problem, which is the underrepresentation of women in international trade. So let's look at some of the numbers. A survey conducted by the ITC across the EU shows that only 1 out of 5 companies exporting goods outside the EU is either managed or owned by a woman. And in Canada, the situation is not much better. Statistics from 2019 from Global Affairs Canada show that only 15% of the SMEs exporting outside of Canada are owned by women. So obviously there's a broader issue of representation, and that cuts across many issues relating to the labor market, social policies, access to finance, cultural norms, not so much the level of education, but the type of education. Now, let's zoom into the issue of compliance to standards. I think in our experience, we see the two issues really matter: size and access to finance. So let's start with size. Women-owned businesses are overrepresented in the category of smaller size companies. So for example, in Canada, 64% of women-owned companies fall into the category of companies employing between 1 and 4 people. And only 43% of men-owned or equally owned companies fall into this category. The same we find in the EU. So 22% of the companies exporting goods outside the EU are women-led. But if you look at companies with a turnover below 2 million euros, we have 1/3 of the companies being women. And if you look at companies with a turnover above 50 million euros, you only have 12% of the companies being women-led. So this has several implications. The first one, it's smaller size companies have fewer resources internally to deal with standards and with trading costs in general. And they also have fewer resources to outsource compliance and certification issues to external consultants or external specialist companies. The second issue is obviously they have lower economies of scale. So they can spread this cost across a much lower value of total exports. So the next question is really how important are standards in terms of trading cost? And our research across non-tariff measures shows that actually standards are a very important determinant of trading cost for smaller size companies. For example, the latest survey of non-tariff measures across the EU shows that for the majority of SMEs, non-tariff measures are substantial and pervasive cost of engaging in international trade. And if you zoom into the sectors that really matter for women-led companies, take clothing, take fresh food, take processed foods, really these are the top determinants of trading cost. Together with rules of origin, you find pre-shipment inspection cost, you find product certification cost, a lot of issues around labeling, for example, and so forth. So what we find is also that the bulk of this cost is not so much in relation to the standards per se, but with the procedural aspects of complying with standards. Access to information, a lot to do with delays at the border, red tape, and that obviously varies with the export market. But overall, we find that a lot of it has to do with the processes around standards, not so much with the content of the standard. The second factor I mentioned is access to finance. So we know this is a general problem. There are a number of issues with it. So women-owned companies tend to be undercapitalized. A study across the EU shows that women-owned companies tend to rely less on external financing and more on personal savings or spousal funds. A study corroborated, for example, in Canada shows that women are less likely to apply for investment funds even when they are creditworthy, and that's because of fear of rejection. And this has major implication because complying with standards requires investment in processes, in products upgrading, and this is very good for women-owned companies because it makes them more productive, more competitive in international markets. So the potential benefits of complying with standards are really immense. Now, this is true in Canada and the EU, but ITC She Trades Initiative works in over 20 countries with women-owned businesses, mostly in Africa and in Asia. So in these countries, on top of the issues of size and access to finance, you have to add additional challenges. For example, access to infrastructure. If you can't have access to proper storage units, processing equipment, transport systems, it's very unlikely for you to be able to bear the cost of complying with standards. It's very difficult very often for companies in developing countries to access information. Sometimes even the fact of being online, it's not an advantage for some of the smaller SMEs. And then language barriers, we find significant language barriers, and even when women-owned SMEs in developing countries access the right information, very often they will need support to really understand where it's worth investing and how they can use standard compliance to better position themselves in international markets. And then finally, compliance cost. In many countries, the testing facilities are not there, or they're very expensive. And you may have to actually fly your products for testing in neighboring countries with more advancing testing facilities. And all of this obviously adds to compliance cost. So in other words, I'd like to say that yes, there is we think a very important gender perspective when looking at compliance to standards. And this is a challenge that cuts across different policy areas. It's not only for the standards communities, but it's for the private sector, for different government agencies, and for a number of policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. I think that you've made some really important points. And I think that even though your experience is more specifically around the Asia and African countries, it's equally as valid in Europe. I think that women-owned businesses in Europe are also more likely to be small and medium enterprises. And it's true that while standardization is important, it is a heavy process, and it's not necessarily written with women and small businesses in mind, so can see benefits. And I think that's changing. That is one of the things that will contribute to that increased GDP that I mentioned in the beginning. So listening to all these potential benefits and the challenges around gender responsive standards, I was wondering if our panelists have some best practices or success stories that you could share with us. Perhaps Deborah, could I go back to you? Do you have some nice success stories?
I have many. I'm happy to have so many members, because then I can share what they have done on top of what we do. But I think maybe my first best practice, and I've already said that, but I would like to emphasize it again, is very much involving everyone to make sure that the change is moving as a whole community. That means all the different levels of standardization, so national, European, international, but that's also men and women, to having everyone committed to the gender responsive standardization idea is key. And I actually have a nice example about that. I forgot exactly when it was compared to when we signed the declaration and when that conversation was very much going on within Senelec. But our technical boards were revising our internal regulations for something technical, and without being really prompted, so really much because of the ongoing conversation, they took it as a great opportunity to revise the text with a gender responsive language. So chairman became chair or chairperson, they, them became the default pronouns, for example. So I think, and I see more and more examples of similar changes in our governing documents, in our external communication materials, etc. So those are really encouraging signs of overall understanding and recognition of the issue, and change towards the right direction. And then I think, again, I've already said it, but it's really at the heart of our approach is the continuous exchanging and complementing of all the activities and initiatives at national level by our members, and then with the international partners. To me, that's very key. And having that type of conversation, it's key to make sure that we're all progressing and that we're all progressing towards the same end goal. So from my members, I've had to pick only a few to stick to the few minutes I've given, but I think it was already mentioned, revising the HR policies to ensure that they are more inclusive. I think Gurvinder, you gave a great example earlier. I also have a very specific example in mind of HR person who adapted a job advertisement language to make sure that it was attracting the right person to the job because they were trying to re-gender balance, if that's a word, a team that had actually too many women. So they were trying to attract a bit more diversity. So that's a good practice. Of course, Gabrielle mentioned the collection of sex disaggregated data of national experts at in the technical bodies of national, European, and international organizations. I think that's a very good start to see the picture of where we are today, and then how we can better improve that and look back and see how much progress we've done. It was also mentioned earlier, but overall awareness raising, not only about the gender issue, but just standardization in general, and the benefits of standardization for business, for innovation, etc., which we are all convinced are, but it's not always the case for everyone in the workforce. So just raising awareness about that as a career path, and especially towards women, is one of the best practice that we're sharing, again, with those networks of women in specific sectors. That's something that several members are involved in. And then
sorry. Yeah, of course. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one, and because I just learned about it and I really like this example. It's from our Swiss member, SNV. They've released a deliverable on community masks, and they've taken the conscious decision of, in the German version of the text, of using a feminine language as the default, because in German it's like French, we have the two gender, I guess, in the spelling. So it's not a gender responsive deliverable per se, but I really find it a great example of how we can make a concrete action towards more gender responsiveness in standardization. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. That's a really nice example. I'm sorry for interrupting. I'm really glad you gave us that example. Judith, if I can go back to you for a moment, because I know that it was a very exciting launch event on Monday this week. ITC, together with the Swedish Institute of Standards and ISO, have just launched a brand new guidance document, what we call an international workshop agreement. Would you like to explain what's so special about this?
Indeed. Indeed, thank you, Melissa. This has been a very important and exciting week for many of us, because we have been working on this for over 2 years. And actually, for some of the experts, over 30 years, because I've been calling for a global agreement on this issue for decades. On Monday, we launched a global guidance on how to define women entrepreneurship. This is the first international workshop agreement ever on gender equality. And it's really a milestone for women's economic empowerment and for women's entrepreneurship. Until now, there has been no global definition on what is a woman-owned business or what is a woman-led business. And that has created a very fragmented landscape in this environment, which meant a number of government stakeholders, corporates, international organizations have been using similar terms to refer to very different concepts, or very different terms to refer to the same concepts. And in some cases, a number of stakeholders don't have a definition at all. Now, why this is a problem? Because this is creating a number of compliance issues for women entrepreneurs. For example, you could be a woman entrepreneur in Nigeria and having to comply with 4 or 5 different criteria of what it means to be a woman on business. And all of it will take time, cost, and liaising with institutions and so forth. In a number of countries, this has caused a lot of delays in implementing women economic and entrepreneurship programs. And then obviously the most obvious one is that there is no database of comparable data on women entrepreneurship. Each country is collecting data on women on businesses and men on businesses on its own when they are collecting the data, and it's virtually impossible to make any comparison. And that's, for example, the case even with the data I just mentioned between Canada and the EU. So this is really a milestone. It will achieve a number of things. The first one is to enable stakeholders, institutions at the government level, international organizations, and so forth, to collect comparable data. It's really facilitating the implementation of a number of women economic empowerment programs. And we have seen it because even before we published, we had public procurement agencies in Nigeria, the Gambia, and Bangladesh discussing about how to define their target group, how to define the women entrepreneurs they want to support through public procurement policies. And it's really had a lot of support and participation from a number of stakeholders. In our case, COVID-19 really threw a spanner into our work, because literally we had to cancel the face-to-face workshop we had scheduled at the last minute, but we really tried to take this as an opportunity to do things differently. And by moving online, we were actually able to organize 16 informal stakeholder consultations within 3 months, and to hold the 2 formal international workshop agreement workshops in October and December, overall involving 350 stakeholders from over 70 countries. And this would have never been possible with physical meetings. So really for us, it was an unexpected but very fortunate change in how we were supposed to implement the process. So now what we are going to do looking forward, we are working with obviously the key partners, the Swedish Institute of Standards and ISO, to promote awareness on this, on the IWA, on how to use it. We have a very diversified group of stakeholders, but we're very lucky because throughout this process, we developed very important partnerships with UN Women, Global Compact, ILO, the International Cooperative Alliance. And this has also been very important because we started off by thinking we would only define women-owned and women-led businesses, but now the IWA includes definitions for women-led cooperatives and for informal entrepreneurs. So it's really the scope of this IWA has been significantly increased. And then the next thing we're doing is the Swedish Institute of Standards is taking the lead in now collecting proposals on new topics for standardization. And in a couple of months, we will be able to get back to everyone with what we think should be priorities for the process for going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. It's really exciting to have seen that launch, and it was also, I think all of us at ISO, we've never seen so much participation in one of these workshop agreements. So it's a clear, I hate to say this, but a benefit of the pandemic that moving to holding all these types of events online is really seeing an increase in, and seems to be seeing an increase in women's participation. I say seems to because we don't actually have any firm statistics yet, but it really looks like that's a benefit. And on that, in that same light, I mean, moving forward in the future, we're just wondering what our panelists think about the challenges and opportunities there are using gender responsive standards and how we can envisage them in the aftermath of the pandemic. Karen, would you be able to perhaps address that question for us? I think that you're muted, Karen.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't hit the button properly as usual. Yes, I will kind of, a lot of has already been said, but I can maybe draw it back together to bring out the focus of what indeed can be done for the future. So like I already said, the pandemic has brought quite some interesting developments. Deborah mentioned already a Swiss document on community face masks. Well, a lot of different European countries have been developing this, including Belgium. And then there was first a European combined document, and now there is a European technical specification being developed, which is a bit further than this first document. Mostly face masks are either surgical face masks, or that we knew before, the surgical face masks, or the respiratory protective masks. So you come from the medical committees and the protective committees. Now, community face coverings is something used by the community and they're a textile product. So we were drawing in all this different perspective, and it was very interesting to see how, yeah, the composition of the committee changed because you had now a much more textile balance in there. And also that a lot of different aspects were starting to be taken into account because of this different background. So I think we can really learn from that. Like as I said, the textile committees have traditionally a much higher participation also of female experts. And I think that also really shows that one has to bring this more forward, especially also in the, for the personal protective equipment. So, and it were people from the textile committees that then started looking into the protective clothing saying, wait a minute, maybe we should look a bit more also in what sizing requirements they took over. And so I'm getting, for one, not only a cross fertilization between the different committees, but yeah, which will then also help everybody a bit more forward. Sorry. And like what Gurvinda, I think, also managed is we need to focus a bit more on the gender balanced participation. But for that, you need to go a bit backwards. Like he mentioned, where do you draw your people from? They're from the stakeholders, and the women are not presented in the stakeholders yet. So in a way, that will still be a bit of a challenge, but maybe one can also try to focus a bit also more on the stakeholder groups and try to encourage them to maybe nominate a woman instead of a man. And to be honest, I do see this with the younger generation coming in. So I think, yeah, that this is a hopeful new development going in the right direction. Maybe there's a lot of daddies discussing with their daughters. So that concludes it from my side here. But
no, thank you very much, Karen. And speaking about fathers discussing with their daughters, Gurvinda, how do you envisage the aftermath of how do you envisage gender responsive standards in the aftermath of the pandemic?
Sure. I would like to start with what Karen mentioned at the end, involving younger generation. If we consider the usual standards development process, right, where people sit across the table, and of course we all know that the men have always dominated the development of technical standards. Also, what we have seen is that the number of the average age of people around the table while developing the standards is quite high. So if we have to attract younger generation, what is it involved? This is the time of the Googles and the Amazons and of the world. And if we have to bring in these younger generation on the table to talk about standards and standards development, we have to figure out some other way to excite them and, as I mentioned, entice them to come to this platform. This younger generation does not have a patience, or maybe not, that's not the right word. They do not have that attention span to sit down on the table for a day or two or three to start talking about the standards, at one go. So this is something which we have to see. Is there a way of developing a new way of developing standards? That is one. One of the other concerns which has been bothering us in Canada is innovation, and that is now, I think, what aligns with what we have to see going forward. So the concern is that we do not have enough technical expertise available on the standards platform. We all know that standards and innovation go in parallel. So development of technical standards, because it has been dominated by men, we have to change the way we look at it. We also understand that the standards cannot be construed as complete, as I mentioned before, if not all stakeholders are represented on the table developing those standards. And I think this is very important, where we have seen that the women in technical area or in the standardization world have not been trained suitably the way men were trained and mentored. This results in women failing in those positions, and we don't want women to be failing in such positions. So apart from this challenge, women are judged by different standards. They don't receive sponsorship, and there are not many qualified women in the technical world, right? So most of our member organizations have realized that to be competitive, they need to have women included in their workforce. Otherwise, they will lose access to half of the workforce. And ignoring gender gap can affect companies to face production disruptions and inefficiency. So there is need to be some more data so that we can analyze the issues and take appropriate steps and decisions. So numbers may not look good, Melissa, but the steps which we are taking, the noise that women and men are making, I am very confident that we will see a sea change in the very near future. And I'm sure maybe in my lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurvinder, and thank you again for bringing us back and ending on such a positive note. I really, yeah, let's hope that we're going to all see the change in our lifetimes. And you're right, we need to make noise. I think I opened with that. I said that I think that this is our biggest challenge, that we build awareness as to why we need to put the investment in gender responsive standards. That for us, the benefits seem obvious. Yes, there could be increased costs for some industries to be able to do that, but the long-term benefits outweigh those costs, and you're going to get the return on investment, and we just need to make noise about that. So I really appreciated you sharing all your insights and experience with us today. It's fascinating. I'm glad this is being recorded, so I have a chance to go back and study in more detail your comments, because it's really, I've learned a lot. But you're not off the hook yet, because we have some questions. So we're just going to quickly address a couple of questions that we've received from our audience. I think that the first question have been, sorry, just a minute. So the first question that we've been asked to answer, and Gabrielle, I think I'm going to pick on you for this one. What can governments do to encourage the uptake of industry by gender responsive standards in product development? So what do governments need to do?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Happy to give a quick response to this. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try not to be too long-winded, but I think when I look at the work that we're doing, at Senelec and at ISO and IEC and at the ITC and other places, what we've started doing is approaching the issue, looking at it from an ecosystem perspective. And I think that, what the work that we've already begun around ISO and IEC, and also as well as at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe at the UNECE, is developing guidance on how to develop gender responsive standards. So an actual hands-on tool that will be handed to technical committees developing standards to ensure that those standards, international as well as domestic standards, are gender responsive. And so I think that when I think of the role of government, it's really to look at what are the tools that are under development, that are on their way, and leveraging those more. And I think that if we're successful in developing this guidance, and I think we will be successful, the outcome is that international standards will become more gender responsive. And in our trade agreements, especially the technical barriers to trade agreement, the requirement is to use international standards first. And so when you think of how this whole system comes together and works together, I think that the role of government in there is to continue to uphold its part of the bargain in that, and encouraging its regulators, encouraging the developers of technical regulations to look at the standard and to prioritize the use of gender responsive standards. That's one. I think there's probably a few others, but that's the one that comes to mind.
Thank you, Gabrielle. We are running quickly out of time, so if you don't mind, we'll just go on to another question. And I can see that we've had actually two questions in some ways with a similar theme about participation and keeping inclusivity in mind while drafting standards and transforming the process. Deborah, would you perhaps like to have a go at answering that? How do you ensure standardizers keep inclusivity in mind while drafting standards? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Yes, I'll give only a few for time reasons. Gabriel already mentioned one, which is developed ISO and IC and UCS level. Those guidance documents, I think that's going to be key tools to ensure that inclusivity and in particular gender inclusivity is taken into account. I think personally, I would like to start by turning to the experts themselves, standardizers, and concretely asking them what other tools do they need to ensure that. We've done already a lot of work in the past few years within Sensenlec about accessibility. We've put a lot of things forward, and I think those are all great practices that we can look at, and we've actually already started exchanging with that group to learn from them. And one of them is that we've incorporated in our new work item forum, whenever you want to create a new standardization deliverable work, we've included a box asking the expert that are putting that request forward, whether the deliverable they're going to develop are going to have an impact on accessibility and in particular people with disabilities. We have a protocol in place in that sense. So all of those good practices, I think, are good examples. But at this stage, we're still really in need of raising awareness. So trainings to standard makers to make sure that this is very much in their head. Recurring slides in plenary meetings is a very good tip. Maybe appointing a gender contact point in your SDO is something that is very, very useful. And then if I can just come back, because yesterday, it's a very fresh anecdote. Yesterday, one of my male coworkers said that he was ready to buy a new bike. He went to that shop, he loved this brand, ready to spend his money. Unfortunately, the model that he wanted doesn't come in his size because he's a bit smaller than the average size. Too bad, he came back with his money in his pocket, and that bike shop lost his business. I think that the fact that we're having this conversation about including a gender aspect is going to be an eye opener for the fact that diversity is not only having women, men are so diverse as well. And there was a comment about intersectionality. I think it's really the beginning of our conversation, touching upon men, women, non-binary, gender, etc., etc. So very exciting future.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Deborah. I agree certainly in the work that we're doing at ISO, and I'm also in a joint group with the IC. We've discussed about how this is really benefits more broadly than just on the binary definition of gender to men and women. And although we're not directly addressing the larger group at the moment, specifically addressing the larger group's needs, we are, by our work, hopefully opening up a greater consideration and making standards more inclusive across the board. Although I just note that we should be careful when we talk about that men will benefit as well because they're coming in different sizes. There are also things to keep in mind that men have a stronger grip strength or broader shoulders. So but those are the types of things that we'll become more and more aware of as we continue with this work. We have another question from Stephanie Ignon, who I think that, Stephanie, you know more about this topic than any of us, but it's a good point that you're making. I'd like to know from the panelists how they would recommend that we're transforming this process because I agree that in some cases participation has been a barrier for both, the process has been a barrier for participation for both women and men. Gabrielle, do you have some ideas on that?
Sure. I saw the comment from Nicole, and I want to address it very quickly, partly because I don't have a lot to say, but I think that your question is a really important one in terms of the work that we've been doing in looking at this. Is, the focus has been very much on gender, and there's a bigger question to be asked. And I think that what you're pointing to in terms of looking at, we talk about intersectionality, but understanding how people from marginalized communities or from visible minority communities who are participating in this, how they are facing a double layer of potential discrimination in terms of participating in the process. And it's something that I don't want to ignore, but I will completely be honest with you to say that we're not there, we're not addressing it right now. It's something that we are talking about, it's something that we're thinking about. I think it's something that as we look forward in terms of collecting sex disaggregated data, we need to ask ourselves what other types of data do we need to collect? How do we expand that so that we have a better sense of what does the representation look like, not just men, women, but also more broadly, and making the system more inclusive. I'm part of the group at the UNECE that's developing the guidance on gender responsive standards. And for me, the approach has been really trying to anchor it within an anti-oppression framework and looking at it from that kind of broader lens of question of how do we approach this in that way. So I guess it's a bit of a non-answer, and but I do want to thank you for bringing that to this conversation, because I think that it's something that's where we need to go in the future. And speaking to Stephanie's question of, well, we've just started asking in the standards world, hey, this has been going on for so long now, this I would say male-dominated perspective. And now that we're starting to chip away at it, it's bringing bigger questions to us. And so I think that this is the time for us to continue to push on that and look for ways to do that. So.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. I think that we're unfortunately out of time. I think we could continue discussing for the rest of the day. And it's a fascinating topic, and I don't think we'll ever get exhausted by it, but we do have to wrap up. So I really appreciated all your insights and participation. Thank you very much to our panelists. And I would like to now invite Georgina Wainwright-Kindrum to close our event. So Georgina is a special advisor on inclusive trade policy development, negotiations and implementation, including on trade and gender. She's also Canada's gender focal point for trade policy, and she's developed Canada's new approach for applying a comprehensive-based analysis plus, GBA plus, to trade negotiations and final agreements. She is the contact point for the implementation of the trade and gender recommendations under CETA.
Okay.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Yes, that's okay. Thank you, Melissa, for the introduction. And I have to thank you, Melissa, for doing such a great job today moderating our panel discussion. It's great to have you from ISO with us, because you work on this issue on a daily basis. So you bring a lot of knowledge to the subject area, and that was really evident. So thank you. I also want to thank our panelists today for their insights and experience in the world of promoting, developing, and using gender responsive standards. They are certainly leaders in this space, that's obvious, and we recognize as well that this is quite a niche area right now, trade and gender and standards. But I think it's probably ready to go mainstream as governments, industries, and consumers increasingly recognize the benefits of gender responsive standards. I think we can all agree, however, that there is so much that needs to be done in this space to ensure that developing and using gender responsive standards become just a standard operating procedure. That said, there is certainly a growing understanding of the importance of gender responsive standards to our economies and societies, and this is heartening. Gender responsive standards are important to facilitate women's effective participation in the economy and trade. These standards are important to ensure that women's participation in the economy and trade as workers, business owners, or consumers is not limited by the lack of access to well-fitting protective gear, the ability to use tools that require a certain strength, or carry a certain load of essential equipment to do a job. We can see that one size fits all doesn't work for all. I especially appreciate the comment that standards are a catalyst for change, and that standards permeate societies and economies, and therefore can influence economic empowerment and the achievement of gender equality. It seems obvious that as gender responsive standards become more common, this will open up new markets and create productivity, competitiveness, and innovation gains for industry. There will certainly be a return on that upfront investment. This will be good for the economy and trade and will increasingly ensure the benefits of trade are more widely shared, including with underrepresented groups such as women. Gender responsive standards may have an especially important role as well as we seek to build back better following the pandemic. So in closing, I want to thank the European Commission for working with Canada on this panel discussion today and for sponsoring the event. It's been a great team effort as usual and indicative once again of our shared values on promoting and facilitating trade for all and inclusive trade. Canada and the EU agree on the trade and gender nexus and the importance of promoting gender equality and women's economic empowerment through trade. With that, I would like to close by thanking you, our audience, for attending and for the great questions too. I hope this will be useful for you in whatever area you work in. Thank you very much. Bye.